Regardless that he's polarizing and that the latest poll numbers currently have him trailing Hillary Clinton, presidential candidate Donald Trump has shown a shrewdness in the election that has been grossly overlooked. Allow me to explain. Remember, Mr. Trump has ran for president before as a Democratic candidate, never gaining much of any momentum and without the stream of incendiary rhetoric. Contrasted to his present run, it is clear Mr. Trump learned much from his first. Win or lose, he's accomplished his ultimate goal of growing his brand. At this point, the personal incentive for any individual to run for president is branding. Make no mistake, Mrs. Clinton has similar motives. Before donor obligations and concerns of the constituency, all presidential candidates primarily share this ambition. Going back to Mr. Trump's ingenuity, he wanted to run again, but knew he couldn't do so and win while running as a Democrat against Mrs. Clinton. Since conceding to Barack Obama, it was well understood among the Democratic elite, apparently all but Bernie Sanders, that Mrs. Clinton was to succeed Barack Obama as the face of the party upon the end of his second term. Mr. Trump's only other alternative was to run as a Republican, whom have been in virtual disarray since George W. Bush's presidency. Correctly sensing an opportunity, Mr. Trump exploited this vulnerability. How he seamlessly inserted himself in Republican politics was tactically shrewd. The attack on President Obama's birth certificate was rudimentary in execution, but genius in its effect. Its intention wasn't to bring light to an actual issue of concern, but to play on the imaginations of the specific demographic. Once Mitt Romney decided not to run, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio were the preordained frontrunners, but Mr. Trump quickly dispatched of them. He did this by further capturing his targeted audience's imagination, attacking issues that affected the Republican base, who were left impressionable due to the fallout from the financial crisis and the fainting stench of George W. Bush's presidency. Mr. Trump highlighted the offshoring jobs, immigration, terrorism by disparaging Mexico, Muslims, and current trade deals. Say what you will of his bombastic approach, but the results speak for themselves. An outsider knew the Republican base better than the established career Republicans did. One of the all-time coups. Ted Cruz saw the vulnerability as well, which is why he was ultimately Mr. Trump's major competition, with honorable mention to the surprising Ben Carson early on. All of this while the mainstream media, even staunch Republican network Fox News, mocked his candidacy along the way. Cleverly, Mr. Trump leveraged the media to his advantage, utilizing Jerry Springer, Howard Stern shock tactics in his diatribe. Notice when he first spewed off about Mexico, the only time he showed any concern was when NASCAR publicly distanced themselves. Undeterred and with a gambler's confidence, he amplified the attack. He realized that when he said something outlandish, the attention was on him. This allowed him to run a very lean and efficient candidacy. Mrs. Clinton has outspent him on advertising more than 4-1. Yet for much of the race, Mr. Trump has been within striking distance, pulling even in the polls on at least 2 occasions. He has also leveraged an undeniable dislike a segment of the country has for Mrs. Clinton, creating a support level that never erodes regardless of how inaccurate or contradictory a statement he makes. Conversely, Mrs. Clinton enjoys a similar support level, buoyed by voters with a heavy disdain for Mr. Trump. Mrs. Clinton is an established politician, hence the dislike of her is based on actions performed as a politician. The disdain for Mr. Trump is one much more correctable, being that it is from his rhetoric being antagonistic throughout his campaign. I've just showed you the undeniable strategic genius Mr. Trump has put forth thus far, which makes his current position in the polls puzzling. Mr. Trump knows that Mrs. Clinton historically has underestimated her opponent. This defective tendency caused her to lose to then presidential candidate Barack Obama, resulted in a murky win against Bernie Sanders, and now she's showing an inability to decisively pull away from a candidate with little political sophistication in himself. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, the presidency is for his taking. Were he facing Bernie Sanders, the race quite possibly would be decided already. Hence, Mr. Trump is failing to exploit a clear opportunity, his projected ambition to be president. He is aware that his rhetoric is simultaneously an asset and a liability. One would think an easy fix. Just tone down the rhetoric and adopt a slightly more appealing disposition. What's confounding is his inability to implement this seemingly simple nuance in his strategy, as if unable to avoid himself. When all the declared bankruptcies and conversion to the Republican Party are taken into account, it shows a clear tendency of someone who is willing to pivot and shift from a losing strategy. Despite changing campaign managers and being a Wharton graduate, Mr. Trump has exhibited some confounding behavior since winning the Republican nomination, in contrast to his business tendencies of the past. To his credit, he's toned down bragging about his poll statistics in his public diatribe, yet still cannot seem to restrain himself long enough to significantly test the fragility of his opponent's lead. As recently as the beginning of their first debate, they were even in the polls. What was telling was that in a debate that suspiciously seemed to be themed on temperament, instead of seizing the moment, Mr. Trump was outclassed and outschemed by Mrs. Clinton. The lights proved too bright for him. For a time, he spoke of appealing to African American voters, a base for Mrs. Clinton simply on name recognition alone, but reasonably in play if her actual horrid record in regards to African American issues was effectively highlighted. Mr. Trump chose to appeal to them by proposing the stop and frisk policy as a solution to police shooting, an absolutely counterintuitive suggestion. Hubris is a mentionable possibility, but the facts render that argument implausible. Considering his tendency to exploit clear opportunities, it is my assessment that Mr. Trump is throwing the fight, if you will, at this point, seemingly utilizing his remaining run to solidify his brand, which has gained in value since his run began. We assert that this logic effectively explains his failure to secure a presidency practically being handed to him. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? The goal is to engage in a constructive discourse. Do not just comment, or that renders it a blurb. Please give a reason for your opinion.